Good afternoon. It's just a little past 4:30 here in Cincinnati. I apologize. I encountered some technical problems with the getting into GoToMeeting. They had some issues on their end, so we're about a minute or two late today. Today, week 5, we're going to discuss Chapter 9, Strategy Implementation, Organizing for Action. Strategy implementation, as the text points out, is everything everything an organization does to execute its strategic plan. Those that formulate strategy, the people in the corner offices, like I like to say, must ask 3 questions. Who, that is, which employees, departments, and sections will carry out the plan, or pieces of the plan? Must operations be aligned to accommodate the plan? You would think that that's the question, but what they're really asking here is, do we have to change our operations? And then when we do that, do they have to be aligned to accommodate the plan? And then finally, how will we assure that everyone is working in sync to implement the plan? First of all, that's a communication issue. It's a follow-up issue. It's one of those things that we have to think about, that just because the boys and girls in the corner offices said this is what we're going to do, that it filters down to the people where the rubber meets the road, and they'll actually do what has been formulated upstairs. And then often it's formulated without input from those folks who are going to be the tactical operators. The authors of the text, Whelan and Hunger, report a number of problems reported by approximately 19% of Fortune 500 companies they encounter when trying to implement their strategic plans. Now, I came up with 19%. They talked about 93 out of 500 Fortune 5 companies. That just means that 93 companies either actually took part in the survey or completed the survey. It could be that some companies completed portions of the survey and didn't complete everything. Surveys achieving around 20% return rate are usually considered fairly decent. Of course, the more you have, the better you are. But 93 out of 500 is roughly 18.6%, so I just rounded up to 19%. Among them were more time was required than anticipated. In other words, they had a timeline in their mind which probably wasn't realistic, maybe because they didn't get input from the appropriate people. Unanticipated problems occurred. So when they were formulating this plan, they didn't stop and think about what could happen here, what could happen there, what are the possibilities of anything happening, and then if they do happen, what are their consequences? Ineffective coordination, that goes back to what we talked about here 2 or 3 seconds ago about communication. Employees involved were not capable, and lower level employees were not trained. So what this normally means is that once the plan is formulated and agreed to, it goes down to most likely mid-level managers. And they're the ones that are going to implement. So they were not considered to be capable of implementing this for various and sundry reasons. And then the folks who are actually going to do the work, the rank and file employee, he or she was not adequately trained. And then finally, managers did not provide leadership and direction. So this is, if you look at these 5 issues, if you will, it just really shows that there not only was there was a lack of good planning, but there was a lack of coordination and a lack of follow through, and et cetera, et cetera. Of those expected to implement the strategy, often those who are expected to implement the strategy are unaware of what needs to happen stemming from a lack of communication. Just buttressing our comment here about communication. We really have problems when we fail to communicate. To be successful, organizations must implement specific programs, procedures, and budgets. Notice the term specific, and that specific should be in front of each of those categories. Specific procedures and specific budgets, as well as specific programs. Plans, strategic plans, to make sure they're implemented the way you want them to be implemented, need to specify, spell out exactly what needs to be done. Now, yes, there can be some leeway in there into how that's done. But you might say, okay, look, this is the end state we want to reach. And we really don't care how you reach that end state as long as that end state is reached. And, drawing a roadmap is always good, but allow enough leeway that people can do this. Now, if you're going to do that, then you have to make sure that the employees have the needed resources, whatever they happen to be, people, money, supplies, equipment, etc. Figure 9.1 on page 275 depicts a matrix of change which is used to determine how new programs may affect existing programs. It allows for examinations of new programs, comparison between them and existing programs, and evaluation. The matrix can be used to determine, I'm going to enumerate these and I'll come back to them, feasibility, sequence, location, pace and nature of change, stakeholder evaluation. Feasibility, in effect, will the transition to new programs be easy or difficult? Is what we want to do, not only the transition, are they doable? Do we have the capability of being able to do this? Do we have people who are trained? It goes back to something we mentioned a few minutes ago. If we don't have that, do we have to do the training? Do we have to bring in somebody from the outside or some bodies from the outside? What's the ultimate cost here? Not only of training, but being able to implement the program. Sequence of execution, a PERT chart, program execution, review and technique, PERT chart, is often used to determine task sequence. And a PERT chart is often used to also indicate which tasks are the most critical and need to be performed maybe before other tasks are being performed. In this case, the matrix is similar as it helps determine where to start. Will the proposed sequence or sequences lead to desired end state? And can the process be halted at various stages? A PERT chart will help you do that. Program review, program evaluation review technique. Location. Can the proposed plan be implemented at our current location without excessive cost and change, or is a new location more desirable? Now, if a new location is more desirable, we're talking about building a facility here or taking over an existing facility and revamping it, re-engineering maybe is a better word here, to fit our purposes. So has that cost been figured into our calculation? Pace and nature of change, slow and steady or intensified? Should the change be incremental or radical? Incremental would be slow and steady. Pardon me, radical would be intensified. Stakeholder evaluation. Have we considered all alternatives and their outcomes? Do we need additional input? Now, when we talk about all alternatives and outcomes, we enumerate the alternatives, and then each outcome with each particular alternative. and try to weigh those pluses and minuses, and obviously taking something that will give us the greatest return for the amount of resources expended. And we have to consider, who's this going to harm in a way? Stakeholders going to be involved all the way through the line. The stakeholders not only as stockholders, but their local community, and there could be education outfits, that could be the government, environment, a number of type things. Procedures. Procedures can be considered as roadmaps, often referred to as standard operating procedures, SOPs. If you've served in the military, you've certainly heard that. That enumerate how tasks are to be accomplished. Again, I like to digress here just a second, says how tasks are to be accomplished. And it may be that you give your employee or employees a certain amount of latitude. We're going to talk about this when we get into job creation in a few minutes, and say, okay, here's the end state we want. And there are general parameters of how this is to be done, but you can do this any way you want, as long as you reach this end state, this amount of quality. It can't be varied over whatever our tolerances are. Outside the upper limit, outside the lower limit. It has to be within tolerance or specifications, if you prefer. So we need to think about those things. I encourage you to read C Strategy Highlight 9.1, Top 10 Excuses for Bad Service. I'm not going to enumerate those, or you can read them as easily as I can. I was a little surprised by some of the answers. I thought the answers were a little convoluted. I don't know that people would actually say the things that were said there, but that's always a possibility. I've never had any of those things said directly to me, but I thought it was interesting. I recommend that you at least glance at it and see some of those. One of the objectives of strategy implementation is to achieve synergy. Synergy, as we know, or should know, or have found out from other courses, is where the whole, that is everyone and everything involved, is greater than the sum of its individual parts. As you may or may not know, that would be a direct reversal of something we learned in geometry, that the sum was equal, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. So with synergy, we're actually exceeding the sum of the individual parts. Researchers suggest that synergy can occur in one of 6 forms. I'm not going to go over them all. I'm going to go over the ones that stood out to me. That does not mean that you should skip the other ones. Just because they resonate with me doesn't mean they'll resonate with you. So just take a few minutes and look at those to make sure that you have at least a smattering of understanding of what each of those are. Sharing know-how. Simply shared knowledge and skills between and among business units. Too often, we find that business units within organizations tend to compete with each other. They compete for scarce resources. They want to be seen as being the best of the best, and so it becomes competition, and it becomes often about the department or the business unit or the division, as opposed to being about the organization. Economies of scale or scope is going to reduce inventory by sharing. And you can find a complete list on page 278. The authors point out that changes in corporate structure follow strategic change. They cite Chandler, who proposed the following sequence. First, new strategy is formulated and then it's implemented. Then problems arise from the implementation of the new strategy. Why? Well, for one thing, pardon me, we've created change. And most of us, if not all of us, have difficulty handling change. And we say that we don't, we say we're adaptable, and yet time after time after time after time, that's proven to be erroneous. We don't like to change. We like to keep things as they were because it's easy. Financial performance declines because of this new strategy implementation, and we're sort of grappling, trying to find out where we are and who we are. Then the new structure is developed to accommodate the strategy implementation. So it's developed, it's then implemented to address problems and financial distress, and then finally profit returns after the new structure is implemented. So what this kind of is saying is that it would be great if you could implement strategy and the accompanying structure at the same time. And what it appears is that we can't do both things at the same time, or we don't think that way. We tend to think linearly. And that if we implement this strategy, everything else is going to follow. In fact of the matter is, it probably doesn't happen. So then we think about stages of corporate development. There are 3 that they mention here in the text, actually 4. Simple structure. Usually we see this with an entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial venture, if you prefer, being a sole proprietor. Now, don't think of sole proprietor in traditional mom and pop shop, although it could be. Think of sole proprietor as a person who has developed an idea or seen a want or a need and is determined to fix that. And he or she is taking off, and they're going to have a simple structure. And the managerial functions of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling may or may not be evident. Now, what I mean by saying, if I say that, is if you have one person running this show, regardless of the number of employees that he or she may have, probably would not be very many, would probably be something significantly less than 100, although that doesn't necessarily hold true. But because this person is an idea person, he or she is focused more on the idea and bringing the idea to the marketplace than he may be or she may be on organization and leadership and control. They're probably focusing more on planning, if in fact they're even focusing on planning. How do I get my product to market or my idea to market or wherever that happens to be? We next find a functional structure which moves away from entrepreneurship and into a product-oriented structure or function. So we now have, this is kind of hard to think about. What this means is now that this entrepreneur, if in fact he or she still owns the business, has moved away from this entrepreneurship, which is kind of an aggressive type thing. Don't think of that as in your face, but aggressive and trying to get to the market, get in the market, find a place in the market for him or herself and the company, product or service, and then to move forward. And so now he or she may, as I alluded to, have sold out or maybe brought in a partner, and now the focus is more on product itself and the structure involved around the product as opposed to idea. So we have now moved from idea, which often is idealistic in the approach, in the business approach, to something that we now have that seems to be a proven entity, uh, proven product, proven idea. Maybe that's a better way to say that. And so we're not focusing so much on this entrepreneurial aspect because we have gotten into the market, we found some success. A divisional structure comes somewhat after that, is seen when an organization diversifies, offering more than one product or a line of products. That is, it now has more than one function, product, and has strategic business units or SBUs. And then beyond the SBU, strategic business unit, this may create competition between and among business units, and the company may become too bureaucratic. That is, it may have too many managerial layers. There's an old story about General Motors. Back even in its heyday, the 1950s and 1960s, and maybe even a little bit before that it was too difficult to get a decision through GM because there were too many layers of management. Of course, GM at one time had 5 divisions: Cadillac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, and Pontiac. Of course, 2 of those are gone today, and that's become more streamlined. And some people say maybe it need to be streamlined more. The organizational life cycle on page 284 of table 9.2 is worth examining. Note it shows a continuum from birth to death. Now, I want to caution you that does not mean that all companies go through these stages, but some well-known companies have, and they're mentioned here in your text. Some went into bankruptcy and survived, came back out, rose like a phoenix from the ashes. Others did not. I don't recall everybody that was mentioned in there, but certainly some prominent airlines have done that. Delta, American Airlines, a couple other ones, and then Macy's department stores. I went through some serious trouble some years ago, and is now doing very well. But it is interesting to look at that because you can follow some of that in some companies that you may well know or did know have fallen into that trap. But certainly Radio Shack, which is one that we know of today, is sort of in that cycle. It's toward the end, and it doesn't seem to be able to get itself out. Another one is probably Kodak. Kodak is probably moving its way back from. I don't know that Kodak actually went through bankruptcy. It may well have, and it's moving itself back from that by it re-engineered itself, but it took a long time, a lot of hurt for it to get to the place that it is in today. Re-engineering is a radical departure from previous practice. In reality, it is a turnaround strategy. The authors quote Michael Hammer, a person who popularized the strategy, who suggests a list of principles for re-engineering, which you can find on page 289 in the text. We're not going to discuss them all, but I want to highlight 2. Those that will do the work are the ones that should make the decisions. It's an interesting concept because we don't think about that in corporate life. We think that the people who are paid the high salaries, and many of them are paid very high salaries, as you know, are the ones that should be making the decisions. What this really means, or at least means to me, is not so much the people who are going to do the work should make the decisions, but they're the ones that should be in on the decision-making process. And the reason I say that is because they're the ones that can give us some ideas. What needs to be expanded? What do we need to do? Where do we need to go? That is not always addressed by folks upstairs because they have a different viewpoint. So we got to look at the people upstairs as being able to set strategy. but that strategy needs to get some input from the folks down below who are going to make the strategy into reality. Capture essential information in one place versus separate data capturing sources in various places. This is very important because you have to have a sole source of information and from which that information is disseminated to many people who have ownership in some part of the strategy or the strategy implementation or something of that nature. Not having a single source means it's in varied places, and usually if it is in varied places, it's not easy to capture and not easy to get back out to the people that need it as quickly as they need it. I don't diminish the list, the others on the list, but those two stood out for me as being very important. And if you want to take that second place, essential information, that boils down to communication. And we are not going to be successful in any enterprise if we don't communicate with the players that need to be communicated with, both the doers and the thinkers. Design jobs that will help implement the strategy. And there are three different types of job design that you can follow. The first is known as job enlargement. That's a pretty easy job redesign tactic to follow. It just means enlarging the jobs. And this is simply combining tasks that may have been performed by different employees and having them performed by one employee instead. Now there's some pluses to this. First of all, by enlarging the number of tasks, this exposes the employee to a variety of things that he or she has not done before, perhaps, and most likely that's true, and gets them skilled in some other parts of the overall operation. What it also says is that if you had 3 or 4 employees completing one large task, if you will, that could be broken down into similar type tasks. If you take those other employees and put them into something that is essential, as opposed to what they're doing here today. They don't need to have done that. They don't need to have gone through that, and they don't need to address those things. Job rotation is exactly what it means. It's rotating an employee or employees through a series of jobs, different jobs. I want to use the term job here as opposed to task. So the employee gains experience and in turn becomes more valuable for the organization. So this is very important here, this job rotation. And you're taking the employee and moving him or her through a series of jobs so that he or she learns additional skills, adds an additional skill set, becomes more knowledgeable perhaps about the entire operation in which he or she is performing various and sundry tasks. But one way to look at this, and I think sometimes we get this confused, is that a series of a job, I'll do this a little bit differently, a job is made up of a series of tasks. And sometimes we tend to interchange those two terms. Task means job, job means task, vice versa. That's not true. That's not the way it's looked upon. A job is a series of tasks or a number of tasks that have to be performed to complete a particular job. All completed at the same time? No. All completed the same day? Maybe not. But these are various and sundry tasks needed that encompass an entire job. The third one is probably, at least to me, and you may have been exposed to, they may have been exposed to the other two as well, and other courses within the curriculum, and that is job enrichment. Pardon me. This strategy gives the employee the resources that he or she needs to complete the tasks, and then provides him or her the autonomy over task completion. So what this says is, Mr. or Miss Employee, here is the job that we want you to complete that has a series of tasks associated with it. Now, we don't care in what sequence you do this. We talked a little bit about this before, but I want to repeat this. We don't care in what series you do this, but we want this end state. And so you can design your work schedule and the associated tasks around what you need to accomplish. Now, there's some really important key things that are needed for job enrichment. First of all, there has to be empowerment. The employee has to be empowered to act on his or her own. Now, that does not mean to say that the employee should not ask someone else to get the needed resources, or who does he or she see for resources, etc. But you're empowering the employee to act. He or she does not have to continually refer to a supervisor to get things done, to schedule tasks, to decide when to work or when to take a break, or whatever we want to talk about here. So that's part of it. The next thing is the person has to have autonomy. Now, you might say to me, autonomy and empowerment are essentially the same thing. And I would say back to you that they're pretty close. Not necessarily the same thing, but they are pretty close. So empowerment is giving somebody the authority to act, but autonomy is allowing the person to act on his or her own. You could still empower somebody to do something, and he or she would still be reporting to a supervisor. When you empower and at the same time give autonomy, this means that the person is now an independent operator. I've used that term. It may be a little strong of a term. Independent operator within an organization, within its division, within his work setting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he or she is no longer dependent upon the supervisor to do things. Empowerment is where the supervisor gives the employee the authority and responsibility to do something, but the supervisor is still there. When you're giving someone both the empowerment and the autonomy, now you're doing something different. You're adding to something that you've not had before. Then another thing that is really important in this job enrichment is to provide feedback, so the employee knows how he or she is performing. That feedback should be as positive as possible. It should be as supportive as possible, and think of it in that fashion. So the employee has, as much as possible, immediacy of learning how well what he or she did is taking hold, what he or she may need to do to change the operation, to make it better, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you should be asking yourself right now, or at least I hope you are, is job enrichment for everybody? And the simple answer to that question is no. It's not for everybody. You have to decide who is capable of doing that. A lot of times it's pretty obvious. You have a person who's, my term, a charger, and he or she wants to get things done and to move in a certain manner. And so that's the person that you probably want to make sure that you're enriching his or her job. And then enriching jobs also talks about, pardon me just a second, also talks about additional skill variety. So the person is not, in a way, stuck with routine, mundane tasks. Now, it's one of the things that we've tried to get away from in manufacturing today and in a lot of workplaces. Some of you may have seen videos about Zappos, the online shoe outfit, and a few other things that it does, and how they have generated a fun atmosphere. People want to come to work, etc. So that's some of the things that you're thinking about here. So the jobs obviously have to be interesting. There has to be some task variety. There has to be some use of skills and intelligence to be able to do this. So you're not going to put just anybody in that job and enrich his or her job, because people aren't ready for that. And so there's an amount of thought that goes into this we have to think about. A job's characteristic model is depicted in highlight 9.2 on page 291, and it's useful in thinking about how to design jobs. If you'll note, it talks about open feedback, which we talked about, vertical load, established client relationships, farm natural work units, combined tasks to increase task variety, etc. There is another source besides the job characteristics model that I don't have handy, but can also be used in tandem with this or in separate from it. Minnesota Manufacturing Index, I believe that's the right title. So this is something that we need to think about, and we need to think about this along the lines, whether we're talking about strategy or something else, about making jobs meaningful for employees. And then finally, as we kind of come to the end of a little bit shortened lecture this evening, is organizations must decide on whether they want, pardon me, a centralized or a decentralized structure. Now, there are pluses and minuses to both of them. Obviously, a centralized structure talks about where decisions are made and how decisions are made, and that things are done in a vertical manner. Probably speaking, there are not a whole lot of organizations that are strictly centralized today. And you should ask yourself a question, or ask me a question, why not? Well, one of the reasons they're not is because of the medium that we're using right now. I'm using something here at my desk, using my PC that has the capability of showing my picture on it, and I'm able to deliver a little bit of a lecture to you. Or if you were on the other end of the line, you were able to dial in now. We could converse in real time. If you had a camera, we could see each other. And that improves things because it helps with communication. So I'm not so sure that there are some companies that are really pretty rigid, although UPS, United Parcel Service, which still follows some of the tenets of Fred Taylor's scientific management, may fall into that category. I don't know that. But one of the reasons that we find fewer managers in the workplace today is simply because we have this thing in front of us that we're talking about now, the PC, that allows people to communicate rather quickly. One of the reasons we had so many layers of management years ago was because we had to use that as a communication medium to get things across, because we didn't have other methods. We didn't have instant messages. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have sending a text, et cetera, et cetera. And so the amount of communication that is, pardon me, instantaneous or almost instantaneous today we didn't have, and we needed people to pass that information along. So that's where a centralized structure comes in. Centralized structures tend to be a little bit more efficient in doing certain things. By the same token, some people think that a centralized structure tends to be non-innovative. In other words, if everything has to go up the stovepipe, if you will, and then come back down, we're not going after people's creative juices, etc. You won't find many centralized structures in the general computer world. .com, companies like Apple and Microsoft and a few other places. Of course, there's also the story that when companies get too large, while they may not be centralized and bureaucratic, they tend to be sclerotic. And that is because they're so large, they have difficulty making decisions. They can't make them quickly and don't get the input, et cetera, et cetera. So there are pluses and minuses to that. One of the reasons that we have the decentralized structure today is it allows for a broader span of control. We can talk to more people at the same time. We don't need so many managers. That's a plus in some cases. It's a minus in other cases. We just have to be careful about how we do that. So that's what companies have to do. They have to choose between whether or not they want to be centralized or decentralized, and understand the pluses and minuses of both. People who are in the decentralized world tend to look at those that are centralized or more centralized as being quote unquote evil. Bad term maybe to use, but certainly they don't care about employees and things of that nature. That's not necessarily true. But what it does mean is that there's probably less room for dissent. So I don't want to keep this going. I did want to make that. I want to tell you about next week. We'll be back next week to talk about change in staffing, chapters 10 and 11. I'll try to keep the amount of time that I use to around right now 40 some odd minutes, like a little bit less than what we used last week, but I'll definitely try not to go over an hour. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you next week. Good night.